Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on guidance on the use of probabilistic methods in nuclear structural integrity substantiation. My name is Simon Brittle. I'm a member of the Structural Technologies and Materials Group Board at IMechE. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll get into the presentation. In October last year, IMechE, jointly with the UK Forum on Engineering Structural Integrity, organised a one-day seminar on this topic, which was held at IMechE HQ. It was a seminar to promote discussion around this topic. It had industry, academia, codes and standards and regulatory input, and it was a very interesting day, I thought. To further the conversation, this webinar will launch a document on the same topic. It's a document that will be hosted on the UK FESI website and will be free to download. It's not quite available yet, but should be within the next week or so. Just a few admin issues still to work through. At the end of today's webinar, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions, which we will try and answer. So please use the Ask a Question function at the bottom of the slides. And finally, to introduce our speaker, Mike Martin is an Associate Fellow in Engineering, specialising in structural integrity at Rolls-Royce, but Mike's role today is representing a UK nuclear industry working group rather than representing Rolls-Royce. And so over to Mike.
My name's Mike Martin, Engineering Associate Fellow in Structural Integrity from Rolls-Royce. My background is in structural integrity analysis, in particular developing mechanistic models for through-life material degradation modes. And I work across the Rolls-Royce nuclear and aerospace sectors in this context. But today I'm representing the Nuclear Structural Integrity Probabilistics Working Group, which I'll talk a lot more about throughout this webinar. So here's the plan for today's discussion. I'll start with background and context before moving on to a discussion of the target reliability approach. This target reliability concept is a central theme of the probabilistic approach, and it's a subject that the working group has discussed to arrive at a set of working principles. So I'll spend a lot of time discussing the construct of the working group and the working principles in more detail as we go through. So the group has generated a document to bring all of this together, which I'll also talk about. I'll then close with a couple of examples showing application of the approaches before moving on to the Q&A session. So moving on to set the scene with some introduction and context. So the webinar today follows on from the jointly hosted IMechE and FESI, that's the UK Forum for Engineering Structural Integrity, one-day seminar that was held back in October last year that some of you may have attended. At this event there were various presentations from UK nuclear sector companies, including manufacturers, operators, subcontractors. The decommissioning side was also represented, as was the regulator, with attendance from the US Nuclear Regulatory Committee and also the UK Office for Nuclear Regulation were there as well. And there were also input from code and standards representatives, including BS 7910 and the R5 panel and also ASME. A number of the talks throughout the day of that October event were from members of the Probabilistics Working Group. And I also provided a talk introducing the working group and the plan to publish a working principles document in a freely available format. And since then, the document has been completed, and that's the front cover that's shown on the left-hand side of the screen there. And FESI have kindly agreed to host it on their website with the address also shown on the screen. I'll spend some time shortly explaining precisely what the document is, and also importantly what it isn't. But before that, I'll provide a bit of background on current nuclear structural integrity challenges and the available codes and standards regulatory guidance that exists. So firstly, on this slide, the arrow shows the traditional route to developing a structural justification, which is invariably done using some sort of stress analysis in a broad sense, meaning that we have some validated material model from test data from which we understand the failure modes, be it burst, creep or fatigue, and we then perform an analysis based on our understanding of loading and the influences of things like manufacturing processes to arrive at some measure of proximity or margin to failure, such as a reserve factor or a fatigue usage factor. And where possible, this is done to the requirements of codes and standards such as IMechE and R6, enabling us to present a structural justification that's accepted by the regulator. Now, exactly what's done depends on the plant type and component and the specific failure modes, but the general route is similar. For example, if we're justifying some kind of pressure-containing component, this will typically be done using a combination of IMechE plus R6. IMechE provides assurance against plastic collapse, incremental plastic collapse and fatigue by imposing a set of stress limits based on material properties. And if these are achieved, then the design is deemed to have a margin to failure, quantified by a reserve factor or a fatigue usage factor. But importantly for today's discussion, the actual proximity to failure is not quantified. This is all done in a deterministic way and is perceived to be conservative, but precisely how conservative or otherwise is unquantified because of the arbitrary accumulation of pessimisms built in along the way. Now, things have moved on, our understanding has developed, and all of the boxes around the edge of the slide here really represent challenges to the way we do our structural analysis, but equally there are actually opportunities for us to do something different. And a lot of work has been done and continues to be done in most of these areas. For example, the detrimental effect of the environment on structural performance continues to be a topic of interest in a wide range of material systems, including environmental fatigue in PWRs, carburization in AGRs, and also delayed hydride cracking in heavy water pressure tube type reactors. And in response to this, a large amount of testing, both at small scale and feature level, has been done, and our understanding of the physics of failure has massively improved. We now understand much better, for example, the influence of microstructure and the damage measures that are best suited to quantifying fatigue initiation. Our structural modelling and analysis methods have also improved in tandem to this. I suppose the key point here is that the structural integrity analysis is an interdisciplinary thing that takes in data from a multitude of sources ranging from manufacturer through to operation and decommissioning. And good work has been done in the individual discipline areas, and the next big opportunity is to develop the codes and standards and regulatory guidance to reflect this. So on the subject of codes and standards and regulatory guidance, this slide provides a summary of the existing regulatory framework. And all of the references here are publicly available documents, so you can go and look them up. Ultimately, all of this on the screen there stems from IAEA top-level safety fundamentals, flowing down into the IAEA specific safety guides such as SSG2, which talks about deterministic safety analysis for nuclear power plants. And the UK ONR, Office for Nuclear Regulation, have developed their own guidance documents, starting with the SAPs, or Safety Assessment Principles for Nuclear Facilities, and flowing down into the Technical Assessment Guides. And these assessment guides draw heavily, and rightly so, on working to accepted national and international codes and standards, such as IMechE and R6, and they also pay reference to advice from expert guidance such as TAGSI, the Technical Advisory Group on Structural Integrity in the UK. I should highlight that this guidance doesn't actually rule out or prevent probabilistic structural analysis per se, and indeed it is integral to the analysis of AGR graphite, but the majority of probabilistic commentary relates more to thermal hydraulic analysis. So one of the aims of the working group is to demonstrate with worked examples the benefits and limitations of application of probabilistic type approaches to structural integrity analysis. So some of the comments in the existing guidance include statements like the ones shown on the screen here, things like demonstrably conservative, suitably conservative, very unlikely, inadequate margin. And what these actually mean in practice is subjective. And although judgment is always going to play an important part, what we're trying to get to with the probabilistics working group is an improved way of quantifying the margin that's kind of implied by these statements on the screen. And there's currently a number of misconceptions or urban myths, in a way, surrounding the use of probabilistic approaches, and a few of these are shown on the screen there. For example, probabilistic is less safe than deterministic, or deterministic means all inputs are set to a worst case, and also things like deterministic has worked for us. Why do we need to change? I'm not going to answer these points specifically here, but another aim of the working group is to provide commentary to address statements like these and improve awareness, so we understand why comments like these actually are not always particularly accurate. So I've now got a few slides that describe what we actually mean when we talk about a probabilistic or target reliability-based structural integrity approach. And this then provides the basis for discussion of the set of working principles that we've arrived at within the structural integrity probabilistics working group. So this slide, which I'm sure many of you have seen before, or something similar at least, shows a schematic view of the increase in a usage parameter, be it stress, strain, stress intensity factor, fatigue usage, creep damage, whatever really, on a through-life basis. Now, the accepted deterministic case will typically result in an acceptable usage factor of just below or something close to unity, based on an arbitrary accumulation of conservatism's judgment. But the actual proximity to failure is unknown and unquantified, and that's represented by the middle blue line on the graph there. Because we don't live in a perfect world, there are often things like manufacturing non-conformances or plant operating excursions that we have to account for, which, if you assess using the original regulator-accepted deterministic approach, will apparently fail as you're already close to the limit. And this is what the red line on the graph is representing. Now, if you take a nominal view of the inputs, there will be a large margin present. So the question for us is how to demonstrate and quantify an acceptable level of conservatism. More typically as well, probabilistic structural integrity approaches have been used in a reactive way for service management and to inform inspection strategies. However, there's also a real opportunity to build on this experience and also apply these type of approaches to new product design. And this opens up a whole new field of opportunities for margin trading, which I will talk about next. The quantification of margin. This view shown on the slide here spells out the current approach in comparison to the future state that we're aiming towards. With the current approach, each contributing discipline builds in an unquantified margin, as I've said a couple of times, potentially resulting in an excess reliability when compared to the actual reliability target from the component or system. I've shown some of the usual inputs on the screen there that we're often concerned with, including material, manufacture, inspection, geometry, and loading. And the size of the bars on the screen in a schematic sense is trying to represent the contribution of that particular input to the overall reliability. Now, where we want to get to is the situation that's described by the lower two future state options bars, in which we understand and can quantify the contribution of each input to the overall reliability. In this way, we can then focus our resources to where they're most effective. Now, this may mean we can take advantage of our known service experience and knowledge of loading to take more credit for this in the overall reliability calculation, and potentially trade this against, for example, ease of manufacturing, perhaps allowing less stringent surface finish requirements. Now I realise that these sort of statements can be contentious, as a relaxation in manufacturing requirements can give the impression that the design is less safe. But this is not necessarily the case when viewed at the system level. Also, this approach can provide the evidence to focus specifically on the need to enhance manufacturing requirements in some way. Essentially, the approach enables us to make better use of the data sources across the whole of the system and life cycle to focus resource where it's best used. And of course, all of this assumes that we know what the target reliability is. This is a topic in its own right, actually, and I'll comment briefly on this a little later on. This slide shows a different view of what I've just talked about on the previous slide, and highlights the integrated nature of testing, mechanistic predictive models, manufacturing and service experience. By developing an improved mechanistic model of the failure mode, in the case shown here, incorporating a higher level of fidelity of microstructural detail, we can select specific tests to validate the predictive model rather than the specific geometrical feature. And that may not be important in all cases. For the example here, when testing nuclear material, there's quite often a number of safety concerns surrounding that. It's invariably expensive, so optimizing the number of tests is a valuable thing to be doing. And by doing that, we support the predictive model rather than doing specific tests for specific geometry cases. We can then use the predictive model to analyze the geometry in terms of reliability rather than arbitrary margins of failure. And in this way, we can start to optimize geometry for manufacturing and inspection on a reliability basis. Building on this, if and when operational data becomes available, for example, we know more about the actual loads that are experienced, then this can also be fed back into the analysis and used to change or inform any of the other steps on the cycle that I've shown on the screen. Now, one key advantage of the probabilistic approach is that it enables use of all of the life cycle data available from manufacturing through to operation and inspection. And picking up on what I just said about service data on the previous slide, the example again shown schematically here shows how operating experience from plant sensors or maybe condition monitoring systems can be used to actively update the reliability assessment as more data is obtained, therefore obtaining an improved view of plant life as more data is obtained. And again, there's standard techniques for doing this, such as Bayesian analysis, that are well established in other industries. Also, this type of analysis can be used to inform infrastructure decisions on the application of sensors and condition monitoring technologies, as the particular worth of the sensor data can be evaluated in comparison to, say, manufacturing data or other inspection data. So now I've set the scene for what we're proposing to do with target reliability approaches within the working group. The next few slides talk about how to get there and the working principles and methods that are available to be used by all of us. And this is precisely why the Nuclear Structure Integrity Probabilistics Working Group was convened last year, with the broad aims of challenging the existing negative perceptions, really, of probabilistic approaches in nuclear structural integrity. And this has culminated in the industry guidance document that I mentioned earlier, that provides a strong basis for further discussion and debate with the codes and standards and regulatory communities. So the Probabilistics Working Group is formed from UK nuclear sector representatives from the organisations shown on the screen. So we've got a really good cross-section of UK nuclear industry and academics with a view on the entire life cycle. There's also no specific focus on one plant type, and indeed the intention is to look beyond current UK AGR and PWR designs towards future designs, future high temperature and Gen 4 designs. So what actually is the document that I've been talking about? It's worth at this stage saying a few words about the working principles document, what it is and what it isn't actually as well. So I'll start with what it is, and I'll read out what's on the screen there. It is a source of guidance and principles for all plant types. It's a collective view of UK academic and industry experts, although not an exhaustive view. And it's also a link to key references and a source of worked examples, providing the foundation for further discussions. But it's also very important here to highlight what it isn't. Firstly, it isn't a code or standard. It's not been endorsed by the regulatory community, the IMechE, or the contributors' organisations. And probably, hopefully it goes without saying, although I'll say it anyway, that the techniques in the document need to be applied by suitably experienced practitioners. So moving on to the content of the document, and this is what I showed back in October last year at the IMechE and FESI event. As I've already covered the background of regulatory guidance, what I'll focus on this afternoon is the working principles and techniques that are readily available to be used. So the working principles are split into three main areas: why, when and where, how to apply, and with a final section focused on validation and future requirements. So the why, when and where essentially talks about the target reliability approach, trading margins, the efficient use of data, the benefits and limitations of structural reliability analysis, and that's really covering the ground that I went through earlier in the webinar. So I've focused now on how to apply the various techniques and look towards some future requirements. So one of the most important principles here is to recognise that a whole host of approaches, and it's worth noting these are existing and well-established approaches are available for use. This subject was covered by a TAGSI review back in 1999. Again, TAGSI, UK Technical Advisory Group on Structural Integrity. And there's a very good journal paper produced by the TAGSI review team that summarises this. And the reference is shown on the bottom of the screen there. This paper describes 3 levels of structural reliability analysis, i.e. all of these provide numerical quantification of reliability, either implicitly or explicitly. And this is all with a nuclear focus as well. I'll talk a bit about the various techniques here. So for level 1 technique is applied, the structural reliability is not calculated explicitly, but is implicit in the approach. For example, the use of partial safety factors. With level 2 approaches such as form or SORM, that's the first and second order reliability methods, the probability is calculated directly but approximately. And finally, with the level 3 approaches such as direct Monte Carlo sampling of distributions, the probability is also calculated explicitly and potentially more accurately than if using a level 2 approach. Now, the best approach for a particular situation depends on what the objective of the analysis is and the maturity of the design. Is it, for example, to provide a structural safety justification, or is it to provide a rapid response to manufacturing non-conformances or in-service data, or maybe also to undertake some sensitivity or scoping studies for a new design? And so the actual approach that's most appropriate will depend on the situation. Rapid approaches like form may be more suitable for scoping and sensitivity studies, whereas the more time-consuming techniques, such as Monte Carlo, may be more suited to a final structural safety justification. So I'll talk about the techniques in a bit more detail here, because in some ways this is the most useful, particularly for the analyst, as you can all go away from this webinar and apply these techniques and start to think about margin in terms of reliability, which is perhaps something that you haven't been doing before. So the R6 failure assessment diagram approach works very well with Monte Carlo sampling of input distributions of toughness, defect size and loading to produce a cloud of assessment points on the FAD. This is what's shown by the blue circle there, and 1 point for each individual trial, and the cloud of points is centered on the nominal positions of the input variables. So the failure probability here can be quantified by evaluating the proportion of points that lie outside the FAD limit function compared to the total number of points. And this is a level 3 approach in the hierarchy of techniques that I've just described. The partial safety factors, this is something that works particularly well with probabilistic fracture mechanics type approaches. In fact, the probabilistic failure assessment diagram that I showed on the previous slide can be used to calibrate an associated level 1 partial safety factor approach. And essentially this approach applies factors to the nominal values of the input parameters to achieve a result with a known reliability. And the table on this slide shows an example of the factors that are applied to the floor size to achieve the target reliability figures that are shown at the top of the table columns. This can be visualized by shifting the cloud of points in the previous failure assessment diagram slide around to achieve a particular proportion of points outside of the failure line. The application of this approach is very specific, though, to a certain loading scenario or geometry, so it has limited application, but within that application does provide a very rapid measure of reliability quantification. So moving on to a brief discussion of the first order reliability method, or form. This approach is, in essence, a mathematical optimization technique that seeks to find a minimum distance between an expanding ellipsoid that represents the probability distribution to the input variables and a limit surface that represents the failure criterion. The minimum distance shown by R on the figure equates the reliability using the standard normal distribution. This approach assumes normality of the input distributions and can be considered as a level 2 approach, as the probability calculation is approximate depending on how well the normal distribution represents the inputs. Worth saying that non-normal input distributions can be converted to normals using standard techniques, and as long as the normal fit is good in the vicinity of the intersection between the ellipsoid and the surface, the method works well. Again, this is a very fast technique, and you can also verify this using one of the other techniques, such as Monte Carlo analysis. Monte Carlo techniques are often perceived to be complex and time-consuming. My final slide here on techniques is a reminder that they don't have to be, as there's various approaches for improving the efficiency. Typically, the Monte Carlo analysis is used to run a structural model many times, sampling from the input distribution to materials, geometry, loads, etc. for each trial. For all but the most simple of finite element models, this is a prohibitively expensive process in terms of computer resources. And a good way of improving this is to generate a response surface representation of the finite element model. The response surface is essentially a functional fit of the structural response to the inputs, and also standard design of experiments techniques can be used to select the finite element runs that are used to fit the response surface. The Monte Carlo analysis can then operate on the response surface instead of the finite element model, and as a result massively reduce the runtime, making large numbers of trials feasible. And all of this is very commonly applied approach using a combination of commercial codes and in-house scripts. So I mentioned earlier that application of structural reliability analysis assumes that you have some knowledge of what the actual target reliability is. And again, this is a fundamental topic in its own right and requires further work, although I'll make a couple of comments now as to the sort of things that can be done and that are currently being developed. Firstly, it's conceptually possible to use the probabilistic safety assessment, or PSA type approach in reverse. And normally this approach is used to establish damage frequencies and dose rates from initiating event frequencies and human factor inputs using a probability event tree type approach. But it's also possible to reverse this procedure, starting with a target damage frequency to establish what the individual components of failure mode reliability targets are. And these can then be used to define an acceptance criterion for any of the other techniques that I've just described. Another option is to develop a set of target reliability criteria that are based on the safety classification of the component system. And whether these approaches are feasible remains to be seen actually to a certain extent, although it's very encouraging to see that an ASME group has been convened very recently to investigate this subject further and investigate the concept of target reliabilities further as well. So I'm looking forward to what comes out of that group in due course. In the document, we also provide some commentary on standard and well-established good practice relating to things like the fitting of distributions, application of certain distribution types, accounting for correlations in inputs, and a lot of this echoes guidance that's already out there, like some of the excellent guidance that's in, for example, the probabilistic appendix to the R5 procedure. There's no need to go into any more detail here. And similarly, in terms of verification and validation, all of the approaches I've talked about are well established, and there's various commercial codes around that can be used, and I'm sure a lot of you will have in-house codes and scripts that you've developed for these purposes. Now, from a verification perspective, it's important to check that you're getting sensible results, as you would do with any other analysis. And this can be achieved with an independent code, although if you're using Monte Carlo analysis, this will effectively double the analysis time. Spot checks of form analyses using Monte Carlo is also useful from a verification standpoint. But the validation requirements of the physical models, I think, are are important. Obviously they're important, and they're the same regardless of whether using a probabilistic or deterministic approach. And there's also a validation precedent for the use of reliability-based approaches in high integrity, high consequence systems from the aerospace and rail sectors. So this is something we can draw some precedent from. So if you saw my talk from the October IMechE FESI event, you'll recognise this slide, and I'll unashamedly use it again here as one of the key difficulties surrounding this topic is achieving a common understanding of the terminology and jargon. And very sure a lot of these terms shown on the screen here will mean slightly different things to you all today. And this is clearly exemplified by the term deterministic, which I pointed out right at the start, has lost its meaning to become synonymous with using worst case and bounding values at all opportunities. So in the document we include a discussion, almost like a glossary of what these terms actually mean. So to close the discussion of the working principles document before moving on to a consideration of case studies, I've summarised the anticipated use of the document on the slide here. So essentially we're aiming to provide a reference for terminology and techniques, demonstrating how margin can be quantified easily using well-established structural reliability methods. And we anticipate initially that the document will encourage application of these methods in parallel with traditional methods to help build capability, and also to provide support to the onward developments of codes or standards in this field. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we're already seeing some of this within the ASME community. So one of the original aims of the working group was to develop a series of case studies that help to explain the benefits and also highlight the limitations of the application of structural reliability methods. So the document as it stands contains case studies provided by both Rolls-Royce and National Nuclear Laboratories that are based on the application of Monte Carlo techniques to both PWR and effluent tank components. We've also referenced a good existing public domain example that considers AGR superheater tubing inspections, again using Monte Carlo. I'll provide some more detail on the Rolls-Royce example in a minute, but I want to point out here that the more case studies that we can include in the document, the better, and there's a good opportunity for everyone to get involved with other examples, so please feel free to get in touch with the working group after today's event. And it will possibly be a good thing to do in the future to separate the working principles section from the case studies section as we gather more case studies. So this example that I'm showing here considers a welded structural component where a manufacturing process change resulted in a change to a key material distribution. Now, the traditional deterministic assessment used a 99.9% bound to the material data, and the effect of this change on the 99% bound was small, leading to a small change in the deterministic stress calculation when you're doing the traditional deterministic analysis. Now, this gives the false perception that the stress response is not sensitive to the manufacturing change, because when we evaluated this using a Monte Carlo approach, the mean stress is observed to change by a much more significant 40%. This slide here shows graphically what I've just talked about on the previous slide, with the material distribution shown on the left-hand side and the corresponding stress distributions on the right. The original distributions are shown in red, and the updated ones resulting from the the process change in blue. Now, the mean stress is significantly affected, it's obvious from the graph here, whereas the 99.9% stress isn't. So this provides us with good evidence to focus on concentrating on the manufacturing process and directing resources to do this. So this final example considers a selection of structural geometrical features that have notionally the same reliability requirement, but are subject to traditional and accepted deterministic analysis. But of course, this has an unquantified accumulation of conservatism within the approach. Now, again, by undertaking Monte Carlo analyses of each of these structural components, these structural features in turn, the level of reliability associated with the deterministic analysis in each case was evaluated. And very interestingly, the analysis showed a variety of reliability predictions for this group of structural features which have the same notional requirement. So this immediately presents us with some good opportunities for doing some of the margin type trades that I described earlier. And the graph on the screen here shows the results for just one of the structural features that I've just talked about. So we're showing output stress as a function of structural reliability, and the traditional deterministic assessment is represented by the line through unity on the vertical axis, and the target reliability is shown by the vertical red line. So in this case, a set of deterministic inputs that is the accepted deterministic case for this component shows an excess reliability when compared to the target. So again, this provides a basis for challenging each of the inputs and an opportunity to trade this margin within the wider system. So to conclude, the working principles document shows how well-established methods can be used to quantify structural reliability, providing an opportunity to focus resources to where they're most effective. And we've provided a basis in the document for increasing awareness and understanding, and for continuing the discussions with the codes and standards and regulatory communities. And indeed, I think the key next step is to develop codes and standards for current and future plant types using structural reliability methods more fundamentally. So that concludes all I was going to say. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and thank you very much for participating.
Okay, I hope people enjoyed that. We're going to look at questions now. So we have our first question, which I think has been up for a little while, but it's just to ask where the Nuclear Structure Integrity Probabilistic Working Principles document can be found.
Yeah, so just in case anyone missed the introduction from Simon, it's Mike Martin here, by the way. So there's been a couple of delays in actually getting the document up. We're hoping to get the document up on the FESI website today. There's a few kind of minor administrative things that we need to work through, but we're expecting within the next couple of weeks the document will be there and free for all to download. So the next kind of set of questions have been around really one of the comments that I made in the talk relating to this kind of perception, like the perception of a reduction in safety if we move towards the kind of approaches that I discussed. So So that's a common theme to questions more generally, actually, not just today. So I think this all comes down to, again, treating and taking a system view of your component or structure, system, whatever it may be. One of the common things that we see is any opportunity to apparently relax a manufacturing process or inspection is treated with suspicion. So the opportunity or what we need to do is demonstrate at a system level why that isn't actually less safe. And the kind of approaches that I've described here show how to do that. For example, if you go in and do a manufacturing operation because you think you need to on a safety basis, at the system level that will or may well require you to do some sort of inspection and then look at the inspection results. The actual inspection process itself will have an associated reliability that might actually introduce the possibility of adding defects into the system. So the kind of safety answer here is to look at the system, not the individual operation. So the safety is given by the system and not the individual constituents.
Okay, so just a reminder to people that you can submit questions using the function below the presentation. So, a question on motivation. Is this fundamentally just about saving cost?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. It's a very common question again that we get through in the working group from a number of sources. And it isn't just about saving cost. I mean, clearly, cost is a key factor across the nuclear sector. In fact, if we're not cost competitive, the nuclear sector is going to, I think, in my opinion, probably sharing the opinion of a number of people, it's facing a real existential crisis. And cost is key to that. But all the players, manufacturers, regulators, operators, all feed into the cost argument in some way. So it isn't all about cost. It's actually about directing resources to where they're most effective. So safety is joined into that. So it kind of links to the previous question. So if we focus resources where we know we need to, i.e., we can balance, say, a manufacturing operation with an improved use of service data, then we can still demonstrate the same safety of the system, but in a more cost-effective way. So this is about moving cost or focusing resources where they're most effective across the life cycle.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, from my perspective as a project user, if you like, of various approaches, I like the idea of having available methods that could help me with finite resources, point those resources at the areas of either greatest risk or greatest opportunity. So that's an aspect as well. Okay, quite a few more questions to go at. How are rare events taken into consideration in reliability methods?
Yes, so rare events are already taken into consideration generally in the sort of probabilistic safety assessment side of the analysis anyway. So what I didn't talk about today is in terms of the initiating event frequencies and the likelihood of occurrence. So that the whole structural justification process is set up to consider things in different ways at the moment, whether it's what's considered to be a likely to occur event, like a design basis accident event, versus something that is a severe accident case, or something that's much less likely to occur, such as the rare events that I think we're referring to in the question. So those would already be assessed using a reliability-based method through the PSA, Probabilistic Safety Assessment. So what we're really saying here is that we do that anyway, but we're applying the approach to the more frequently occurring design basis type events, so using the same kind of techniques.
Okay. Thanks. We've got a question here on how do you reconcile a target reliability approach for a new design against the ALARP, so the as low as reasonably practicable principle. How do you make sure that using best estimate type methods, you're still making sure that your risks are as low as practicable?
Yeah, I mean this is a good question. So the target reliability approach will be comparing against a target acceptance criterion. So I think a lot of that is handled by what the acceptance criteria actually are for those particular components. I mean, I don't know whether you've got any other input on this one, Simon, but there's quite a lot of things surrounding the kind of dose, the worker personnel dose side of things that
and I guess overall risk.
Overall risk, yeah.
Yeah, and I think my take on this would be to go back to your earlier comment about thinking about the system. So I've certainly seen examples down the years where, in trying to achieve an as low as reasonably practicable risk for a specific issue, we've made decisions which, in the systems context, probably result in an increase in risk, and then we've become aware of that and had to step backwards. So it feels to me like probabilistic approaches is and particularly when you've got graded levels of probabilistic assessment available in your armoury, in new design gives you a quick method if you're looking at the level 1 type approaches, quick method to try and assess which options might present the lowest overall risk, rather than looking at individual components. You can quickly generate almost a map of where your best opportunities to best manage risk overall lie. And there are always competing elements of design, aren't there? So,
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Another question, which I think you might have touched on, but it's worth fleshing out a little. Can you quantify the contribution from inspection on this process? I mean, I'll make a quick comment, but my quick comment is if we try to get into probability of detection type studies, I guess we need large data sets, which we don't always have available to us in nuclear. So given that context, which I suspect is behind the question, what is the contribution of inspection to probabilistic studies?
Well, there are things that could be. I mean, if you do know anything about the inspection process, if you have any reliability numbers associated with that, likelihoods of detection and all of that kind of thing, that can be fed into the overall system and used as would any other data source within there. So that can be used in that trading perspective in that way. I think it can also be used you can make some inferences about, is the inspection actually telling you anything useful about the system as well. That AGR superheater example that I mentioned, if you check the references out there, there's a couple of very good papers there, but they weave in the inspection process into their probabilistic model, and that is then used to show that that there's some real benefit in doing that. I can't recall the details here. I'd recommend looking at the AGR papers there.
Okay, thank you. Still quite a few questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. One here, 90% reliability may mean 10 structures have a chance of failure, or 9 won't fail and 1 certainly will fail. So how do we understand that and make sure that we're not making wrong decisions based on a view of 90% reliability?
Yeah.
does the question mean what I've interpreted it to mean?
Yeah, well, we're looking at a lot smaller kind of numbers than that generally, aren't we? 9 won't fail and 1 certainly will fail. How do we know this? I don't think we're saying that isn't the case, actually.
So this probably goes back to setting the right target for reliability.
Yeah.
And that you highlighted in the presentation, that's pretty fundamental. So certainly I would have thought we'd be aiming for 90% target reliability. We'd be aiming for 10 to the minus.
Again, yeah, it depends. It depends on the consequences of the particular component system, doesn't it? And then that feeds, as Simon says there, into the definition of what that target reliability is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I would say there.
Yeah, and I mean, it maybe links to another point that we will have some components and features within a system where the consequences of failure are, significantly higher than others, but the probability of failure is significantly lower. And I think it's a bit of an eternal debate within nuclear about how much effort you focus on the high consequence, very low probability failure sites versus the very low consequence but higher probability failure. And I guess as with all of these examples, probabilistics is helping to try and guide you to focus your effort in the right areas. And it might be that you still put more weight towards the higher consequence, but you might also divert some effort towards the higher probability.
Yeah.
Okay. Question: What is the current perception of UK nuclear regulator regarding the use of probabilistic methods as a complement or substitution to deterministic methods?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. The UK nuclear regulator is, I think, kind of naturally sceptical of these approaches, but it's down to us as the operators, manufacturers, to demonstrate why they're not a suitable thing to do for each particular case. I think the regulator is open and receptive to presenting these type of arguments. I think what the regulator would like to see at present, and it's one of the reasons that we've focused on trying to build a set of case studies, is actually what are the differences between the two methods. What, on one hand, if you do a traditional deterministic case, what is that saying anything different, or how do you interpret that in terms of the probabilistic case? We have had some preliminary discussions with the regulatory community on this. In fact, they have seen a preliminary version of this document. They weren't involved in the working group at all, because being a regulatory body, they need to be separate from that. But I think they have, in my opinion, an open mind to this, and it's up to us to demonstrate to them why it's a sensible way forward.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I know we've put a healthy caution into the document, but the the application of these methods, as with any methods to any issue, ought to be discussed with customers and regulators in advance. Getting early buy-in that a particular approach is accepted or not is really important. Good. We're very nearly out of time. There is a quick question here on Brexit and whether that impacts on the methodology. I think my gut feel would be probably no, because this is a UK industry-led initiative, but we are reaching out internationally.
Yeah, I think so, and it will be working in the UK side. We'll be working to satisfy ONR and regulatory guidance. So the ONR will follow IAEA. I would not anticipate that ONR would stop looking at what the IAEA do just because of Brexit. I think that is not going to happen. So I don't see Brexit per se influencing this.
That's great. Okay. Apologies, there are a few questions that we didn't quite manage to get to, but I hope we've addressed a fairly broad range of topics there. We are at time, so thank you very much, everybody, for taking part and for feeding us some really interesting questions. Thank you, Mike, for a very thought-provoking webinar, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day.
Thank you.